Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent 15 years cataloging historical photographs at the Connecticut Historical Society, but nothing had prepared her for what she discovered on that gray February morning. The donation box from the recently deceased estate of Eleanor Whitman contained dozens of family photographs, most yellowed and cracked with age, but one image from 1911 immediately caught her attention. The photograph showed what appeared to be a typical middle-class family portrait taken in a Hartford photography studio. The stern-faced father in his Sunday best stood behind a seated mother wearing an elaborate Victorian dress. 3 children were arranged carefully around them, 2 boys in matching sailor suits, and a girl of perhaps 8 years old in a white dress with lace trim. At first glance, everything seemed perfectly normal for the era. The formal poses, the serious expressions, the careful arrangement, all typical of early 20th century family photography, when exposures required subjects to remain perfectly still for several seconds. But as Dr. Mitchell examined the photograph under her magnifying glass, something made her pause. There was something unsettling about the little girl's positioning. While the rest of the family stared directly at the camera with the expected stoic expressions of the time, the girl's eyes seemed to hold a different emotion entirely. Her hands, folded in her lap, appeared tense. The knuckles were white, suggesting she was gripping something tightly. Dr. Mitchell adjusted her desk lamp and leaned closer. What she saw next made her breath catch in her throat. The girl's fingers weren't simply folded. They were positioned in a very specific way. A way that, in 1911, would have meant something very particular to those who knew how to read the signs. Dr. Mitchell reached for her phone with trembling hands. This photograph wasn't just a family portrait. It was evidence of something far more sinister. A silent cry for help that had gone unnoticed for over a century. Dr. Mitchell's heart raced as she compared the girl's hand position to historical references in her computer database. The positioning was unmistakable. The child's fingers formed what was known in 1911 as a distress signal, a secret communication method taught to children by social reformers of the Progressive Era. During the early 1900s, as awareness of child abuse began to emerge as a social issue, several women's organizations had developed discreet ways for children to signal for help. The most common was a specific finger positioning that could be captured in photographs, a way for children to leave evidence without their abusers knowing. The technique had been pioneered by Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago and spread to other cities through the network of settlement houses and women's clubs. Social workers would teach children the signal during school visits, hoping that if a child were ever photographed, they might have the courage to use it. Dr. Mitchell pulled up city records from Hartford in 1911. The photography studio's address was stamped on the back of the photograph. Hartwell Photography, Main Street, Hartford. She cross-referenced this with newspaper archives and found several advertisements for the studio, which specialized in family portraits, and was particularly popular among Hartford's growing middle class. But what truly sent chills down her spine was what she discovered in the Hartford Courant archives. In late 1911, there had been a brief mention of a family tragedy involving a fire that had killed several members of a local family. The details were sparse. Newspapers of the era rarely reported such incidents with the thoroughness of modern journalism. The girl in the photograph had been trying to tell someone something. Her carefully positioned hands weren't random nervousness or coincidental finger placement. They were a deliberate, desperate attempt to communicate danger. Dr. Mitchell realized she was looking at more than just a historical photograph. She was looking at evidence of a child's courage in the face of unimaginable circumstances, a silent scream that had echoed across more than a century, finally ready to be heard. The question now was, what exactly had this little girl been trying to say? Dr. Mitchell knew she needed expert help to properly interpret what she discovered. She contacted Dr. James Patterson, a specialist in historical child welfare and progressive-era social reform at Yale University. When she emailed him the photograph, his response was immediate and urgent. "This is extraordinary." Dr. Patterson wrote back within an hour. "I've been studying these distress signals for 20 years, and this is one of the clearest examples I've ever seen. The girl's positioning is textbook. She's indicating immediate physical danger in the home." They arranged to meet the following day at the Historical Society. Dr. Patterson arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase filled with documentation about early child protection efforts. He spread the materials across Dr. Mitchell's desk, creating a timeline of social reform movements in Connecticut during the early 1900s. "The signal your girl is using was specifically taught to indicate physical abuse," Dr. Patterson explained, pointing to diagrams from a 1910 social worker's manual. "But there's something else. See how her thumb is positioned? That was added later, around 1911, to indicate when a child's life was in immediate danger." Together, they began researching the family in the photograph. The studio's business records had been donated to the Historical Society years earlier, and after hours of searching through ledgers, they found the entry. Family portrait, September 15th, 1911, paid by Thomas Hartford, 47 Maple Street. City directories from 1911 confirmed Thomas Hartford as a resident of 47 Maple Street, listed as a foreman at the Hartford Manufacturing Company. His wife was named Mary, and they had 3 children: Robert, age 12, William, age 10, and Emma, age 8. Emma. That was the little girl's name. Dr. Mitchell felt a strange connection forming across the decades to this child who had tried so desperately to communicate her fear. But when they searched for more records about the Hartford family, they encountered a disturbing gap. After September 1911, there were no more city directory listings for the family, no census records, no school enrollment records, no death certificates on file. It was as if the entire Hartford family had simply vanished from Hartford's official records just weeks after this photograph was taken. The absence of records was more telling than their presence might have been. Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Patterson spent the next week combing through every available database, but the Hartford family seemed to have disappeared completely from official documentation after the autumn of 1911. Dr. Mitchell decided to visit 47 Maple Street to see what, if anything, remained of the family's former home. The address led her to a small residential neighborhood that had changed dramatically over the past century. Where the Hartford house once stood, there was now a small commercial building housing a dry cleaner and a coffee shop. At the Hartford City Clerk's office, an elderly clerk named Robert Chen remembered dealing with old property records from that era. Maple Street had a terrible fire in 1911. He recalled pulling out a thick folder of insurance documents. Several houses were destroyed. The city had to rebuild that entire block. The insurance records told a partial story. The Hartford house had indeed burned down in November 1911, just 2 months after the family portrait was taken. But the insurance claim listed the cause as suspicious origin and noted that no remains had been found in the debris. Dr. Patterson discovered something equally disturbing in the Hartford Manufacturing Company employment records, which had been preserved at the state archives. Thomas Hartford had stopped showing up for work on October 30th, 1911. His supervisor had noted in the company ledger, T. Hartford absent without notice, position terminated. The timeline was becoming clearer and terrifying. Something had happened to the Hartford family between the taking of their photograph in September and the mysterious fire in November. Emma's distress signal had been prophetic. She had, indeed, been in immediate danger. But the mystery deepened when Dr. Mitchell found a brief mention in the Hartford Courant from December 1911. A small item buried on page 6 mentioned that Hartford police were investigating the unexplained disappearance of a local family, but that the investigation had been suspended due to lack of evidence. The article mentioned that neighbors had reported seeing the family leave their home hurriedly in late October, carrying suitcases and appearing distressed. One neighbor was quoted as saying the children looked frightened. Emma had tried to tell the world she was in danger. Now, more than a century later, someone was finally listening. Dr. Mitchell's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Hartford neighborhood records at the local library, she overheard an elderly woman discussing old family photographs with a librarian. The woman mentioned that her grandmother had lived on Maple Street in 1911 and had often spoken about a family that had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The woman introduced herself as Helen Murphy, age 87, whose grandmother Catherine Murphy had lived at 45 Maple Street, directly next door to the Hartford family. Helen still possessed her grandmother's diary, which she had kept as a family keepsake but had never fully read. Grandmother wrote in it every day, Helen explained when Dr. Mitchell contacted her. She was always watching the neighborhood, keeping track of everyone's business. Mother used to joke that she was the unofficial neighborhood historian. When Helen retrieved the diary from her attic, they discovered that Catherine Murphy had indeed written extensively about her neighbors, including detailed observations about the Hartford family. The entries from 1911 painted a disturbing picture of escalating domestic violence. September 20th, 1911, the shouting from the Hartford house grows worse each night. Poor Mary tries to quiet Thomas, but he's been drinking more since losing that promotion at the factory. The children stay very quiet during his rages. October 5th, 1911. Little Emma came to my garden fence today while I was hanging laundry. She didn't speak, but I could see bruises on her arms. When I asked if she was hurt, she just shook her head and ran back inside. Something is terribly wrong in that house. October 15th, 1911. Thomas Hartford came home in a fury tonight. I could hear him screaming about money and blame. Mary was crying, and I heard one of the boys pleading with his father to stop. This cannot continue. The final entry about the Hartford family was dated October 28th, 1911. I fear the worst has happened. I haven't seen Mary or the children in 3 days, though Thomas has been coming and going at odd hours. He loaded several large bundles into a wagon this morning before dawn. When I tried to speak with him over the fence, he threatened me and told me to mind my own business. I believe those children are in grave danger. Catherine Murphy had been the witness Emma needed, but in 1911, there had been no systems in place to protect children from family violence. Emma's silent cry for help in that photograph had been her only way to leave evidence of what was happening behind closed doors. Catherine Murphy's diary provided the crucial clue that Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Patterson needed to continue their investigation. The mention of Thomas Hartford loading bundles into a wagon before dawn suggested the family hadn't simply disappeared. They had been taken somewhere. Dr. Patterson contacted colleagues at universities throughout New England, hoping to find similar cases or records that might indicate where Thomas Hartford could have taken his family. The response from Dr. Rebecca Foster at the University of Vermont proved invaluable. We have extensive records of families who moved to remote areas during economic hardship, Dr. Foster explained during a phone. Many men who couldn't cope with industrial pressures in the cities would take their families to isolated rural areas where they could avoid questions and scrutiny. Vermont land records from 1911 revealed that Thomas Hartford had purchased 20 acres of remote woodland in the northeastern part of the state in early November 1911 using cash. The property was located nearly 15 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by rough logging roads. The purchase was made just days after Catherine Murphy's final diary entry about the loaded wagon. Dr. Mitchell felt a chill as she realized Emma's distress signal had been even more accurate than they'd initially understood. The child had somehow sensed that her family was about to be taken to a place where no one would hear them scream. Local Vermont historical societies provided additional pieces of the puzzle. The area where Hartford had purchased land was known for its harsh winters and isolation. Several families who had attempted to homestead there during that era had been found dead from exposure or malnutrition when spring arrived. But most significantly, Dr. Foster had found records indicating that Hartford had visited the property alone in December 1911 and January 1912, making several trips to purchase supplies. If his family had been with him, why was he making these trips solo? The terrible implication was becoming clear. Emma's hand signal in that September photograph hadn't just been indicating current abuse. It had been a desperate attempt to document her existence before she disappeared forever. Dr. Mitchell knew they had to visit the Vermont property. Somewhere in those remote woods might be the evidence that would finally give Emma Hartford the justice she had tried so desperately to secure more than a century ago. Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Patterson made the journey to northeastern Vermont on a cold March morning, accompanied by local historian and archaeologist Dr. Maria Santos, who specialized in locating historical homestead sites. The property that Thomas Hartford had purchased in 1911 was still largely undeveloped, now part of a larger tract owned by a paper company. Using GPS coordinates derived from the original land survey, they hiked through snow-covered woods to reach the approximate location of Hartford's property. Dr. Santos brought ground-penetrating radar equipment, hoping to locate any structural remains that might still exist beneath more than a century of forest growth. The terrain was brutal, even in modern winter gear. The isolation was complete, no sounds of civilization reached them, and the cell phone service was non-existent. Dr. Mitchell couldn't imagine how terrifying this place must have been for Mary Hartford and her 3 children. Arriving here in November 1911 with winter approaching, after several hours of searching, Dr. Santos's equipment detected anomalies in the ground that suggested the presence of buried structures. They began careful excavation in a small clearing that seemed to match the description from Hartford's property deed. What they uncovered made Dr. Mitchell's hands shake. The remains of a crude wooden foundation, barely large enough for a single room. Scattered around the site were fragments of pottery, rusted metal tools, and pieces of fabric that had somehow survived the harsh Vermont winters. But the most significant discovery was a small metal object that Dr. Santos unearthed near what appeared to have been the back corner of the structure. It was a child's hair ribbon made of metal thread that had resisted decay. The style matched exactly what Emma Hartford had been wearing in the 1911 photograph. Dr. Santos also found evidence that the structure had been deliberately burned. Charcoal fragments and melted metal suggested an intense fire, consistent with someone destroying evidence rather than an accidental blaze. Local Vermont records confirmed that Thomas Hartford had made his final recorded visit to the property in February 1912. After that, he too disappeared from all official documentation. The land was eventually reclaimed by the state for unpaid taxes. As the team prepared to leave the site, Dr. Mitchell held Emma's hair ribbon in her gloved hands. This small piece of metal was all that remained of a little girl who had tried so hard to tell the world she was in danger. Her message, encoded in her hands in that family photograph, had finally been received. But Emma deserved more than just discovery. She deserved recognition and remembrance. Returning from Vermont, Dr. Mitchell felt a profound responsibility to ensure Emma Hartford's story would be told properly. She contacted local news outlets, but quickly realized that the story needed to reach a broader audience to have the impact Emma deserved. Working with Dr. Patterson and Dr. Santos, she prepared a comprehensive report documenting their findings. The story was picked up by several major newspapers and history magazines, but it was the social media response that truly honored Emma's courage. Parents, child welfare advocates, and historians shared the story widely, using it to discuss both historical and contemporary issues of child protection. Emma's photograph became a symbol of children's resilience and the importance of listening when young people try to communicate distress. The Connecticut Historical Society organized a special exhibition centered on Emma's story titled Silent Voices, Children's Stories from the Past. The 1911 family photograph was displayed prominently, with detailed explanations of the hand signals that progressive reformers had taught children over a century ago. Most meaningfully, child protection organizations began using Emma's story in their training programs, showing how important it is to recognize when children are trying to communicate danger. The hand signals that Emma had learned were no longer necessary, but her courage in using them continued to inspire new generations of advocates. Dr. Mitchell also worked with genealogy websites to trace any potential descendants of the Hartford family. They discovered that Thomas Hartford had a brother who had remained in Connecticut, and several of his descendants still lived in the Hartford area. When contacted about their family's history, these descendants were shocked to learn about Emma and her siblings. They had grown up hearing vague stories about relatives who had disappeared in the early 1900s, but no one had ever known the true circumstances. The family asked Dr. Mitchell to help them create a proper memorial for Emma, Robert, William, and Mary Hartford. They wanted to ensure that these family members, who had been erased from official records by violence, would be remembered with dignity and honor. Together, they planned a memorial service that would acknowledge both the tragedy of what had happened and the extraordinary courage Emma had shown in trying to document her family's danger. The memorial service for the Hartford family took place on a warm September morning in 2024, exactly 113 years after their final photograph was taken. It was held at Grove Hill Cemetery in Hartford, where a memorial stone had been erected in their honor through donations from the community and child welfare organization. Dr. Mitchell spoke about Emma's courage and the importance of her message reaching across the centuries. Emma Hartford couldn't speak openly about the danger her family faced. She told the gathered crowd of descendants, historians, and child advocates, but she found a way to leave evidence to tell us what was happening. Her hands, positioned so carefully in that photograph, were her voice when her voice was silenced. The memorial stone was simple but powerful, engraved with the names of Mary Hartford and her 3 children, along with the dates they lived and the date of their disappearance. Below their names, the inscription read, "Their silence has been broken, their story lives on." Representatives from several child protection agencies attended the service, each speaking about how Emma's story had influenced their work. Many noted that while the specific hand signals Emma used were no longer taught, the principle remained the same. Children will find ways to communicate when they are in danger, and adults must learn to recognize and respond to those communications. Local schools requested copies of the exhibition materials to use in teaching children about personal safety and the importance of seeking help when they feel threatened. Emma's story became part of Hartford's official historical curriculum, ensuring that her courage would be remembered by future generations. The Hartford family descendants shared their own reflections on learning about this lost branch of their family tree. "We always wondered about the relatives who disappeared," said James Hartford, Thomas Hartford's great-great-nephew. "Learning the truth was painful, but it was also important. Emma and her mother and brothers deserved to be remembered." As the service concluded, Dr. Mitchell placed a single white rose on the memorial stone, the same type of flower that Emma had worn in her dress in the 1911 photograph. The flower represented not just remembrance, but the hope that Emma's courage would continue to inspire protection for children everywhere. The original photograph was returned to its place of honor at the Historical Society, but now it was accompanied by the full story of the little girl whose hands had finally been heard. 6 months after the memorial service, Dr. Mitchell received a letter that brought her story full circle. It came from a teacher in California who had used Emma Hartford's story in her classroom, teaching students about historical research and child safety. "One of my students noticed something in a family photograph from the 1920s, the teacher wrote. After learning about Emma's hand signals, she recognized that her great-grandmother seemed to be positioning her hands in a similar way. We're now researching that family's story, and we've already uncovered evidence of domestic violence that had been hidden for generations. Emma's courage was rippling forward through time, helping other families uncover and understand their own difficult histories." Dr. Mitchell realized that this had always been the deeper purpose of her work, not just to catalog the past, but to help the past speak to the present in meaningful ways. The Connecticut Historical Society established the Emma Hartford Research Grant, providing funding for historians studying child welfare and family violence in historical contexts. Dr. Patterson used the grant to digitize thousands of family photographs from the early 1900s, training volunteers to recognize the subtle signs that children might have used to communicate distress. More importantly, modern child protection agencies began incorporating lessons from historical cases like Emma's into their training programs. Social workers learned to look for nonverbal communications and to understand that children's attempts to seek help might take forms that adults didn't immediately recognize. Dr. Mitchell often returned to look at Emma's photograph, still displayed prominently in the Historical Society's main exhibition hall. Visitors frequently stopped to read Emma's story, many of them visibly moved by the little girl's courage and the century-long journey to understand her message. Emma Hartford never lived to see her message received, never knew that someone would eventually understand what she was trying to communicate through her carefully positioned hands. But her courage had created a legacy that extended far beyond her own tragic circumstances. In learning to hear Emma's silent voice, countless other children had been given the chance to be heard as well. Her hands, frozen in that 1911 photograph, had become a bridge across time, connecting past and present in the service of protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that no child's cry for help goes unheard. Emma's story had become exactly what she had hoped it would be, proof that she had existed, that she had mattered, and that even in the darkest circumstances, courage can find a way to speak the truth.